We're here to grapple with just one of the 74 readings from this terrific new volume, Jack London's short story, To Build a Fire. Like so many others, London made the incredibly arduous journey by foot and handcrafted boat from Dyea in Alaska over Chilkoot Pass, a 3/4 mile, 45-degree angle obstacle course, and eventually down the Yukon River into the Northwest Territories. The only gold he brought back, however, was an experience that he would mine for gems of literature for much of his writing life, as evidenced in novels like Call of the Wild and White Fang, and of course in the short story that we will pan for glints and gleams of insight into our nature as Americans and as human beings today, To Build a Fire. One preliminary note: many listeners may well have encountered this short story already in that high school or college survey course on American literature, since literary critics regard it as a prime example of a school of writing known as naturalism. We urge listeners to put aside for a moment whatever analytical tools they might bring from that encounter, because I suspect we're going to have quite a different discussion of the story today. So let's get underway. First, Amy, can you just give us, for listeners who may not be familiar with the story, can you give us a quick outline of the story?
Okay, so on a very frigid, sunless day, an unnamed man sets out on a 9-hour walk on the least traveled road in the Yukon. His purpose is really to scope out islands in the Yukon to see whether they could get logs from there during the spring. He has with him only the clothes that he's wearing, plus a watch, plus some chewing tobacco, plus a couple of matches, some pieces of birch bark, and lunch. Otherwise, nothing. He's accompanied by a husky who seems to be far more impressed by the temperature and the coldness than he is. He seems to be perfectly unfazed by it. We're told that he begins at 9 a.m. He pauses at 10. At 12:30, he stops to eat his lunch. He starts to eat and then remembers that he has to build a fire. So he builds his fire, he eats his lunch, he warms himself up over the fire, he has a leisurely smoke, and then he continues his walk. He continues until we're told it happens. What is it? There are icy springs, though the Yukon is completely covered with ice. There are springs, mountain springs that come down, and apparently there's no way that they're going to be eliminated, even during the deepest frost. And by the way, the weather is, we're told, 75 degrees below zero, and which means about 107 degrees of frost. It happened. He walked into one of these springs, gets wet up to the mid-calf, and then tries to build another fire to dry off. He builds a fire successfully, but suddenly it happens again. He realizes that he built the fire under a tree, and the tree is freighted with snow, and all of it comes down right on top of the fire and snuffs it out. He tries desperately to build a third fire. While he's doing it, he burns his hands, and he's using actually his own hands, burnt hands, to try to fuel that fire, which is pretty rapidly snuffed out. Then he panics, and he starts running off. He suddenly realizes that it's absolutely unseemly to walk around with like a chicken without his head, And he proceeds to sit down and to meet death decently, or as our narrator will tell us, with dignity.
This is not a Hollywood story for your readers, is it? And yet you've selected this to illustrate American freedom and individuality. What is it about this man that we should be led to think is a particular a good example of American freedom and individuality?
Well, I would say that he's certainly independent. He hears advice from the old-timer at Sulphur Creek, but he relies basically on his own judgment, on his own capacity. He's not only independent, but he is self-reliant. He is competent. Even though he's a newcomer to the territory, he's very observant. He's a keen observer and knows the things around him. When the going gets tough, although he might panic for a moment, he's able to beat down that panic with efforts of self-command. He's practical. He's enduring. Not to be omitted is that which relates to the title of the story. He knows how to make a fire.
He also knows that that's what stands between life and death.
Right.
Even though we're told specifically he has no imagination. He knows that.
He has no imagination, and indeed, he seems to be out in the wilderness for the least imaginative of reasons, which is, right, to scope out an island in the Yukon, islands in the Yukon for logs that might be floated down at the spring flood. What's that all about? Why is that an American? Is that an American characteristic?
This shows that he's enterprising, that he's looking for ways to turn the things that are about him, in this case, certain natural things, and turn them into things that are useful and profitable. I mean,
It also suggests that though we're told specifically he has no imagination about the meanings or significances of things, which means he doesn't really understand that one could die from doing what he's doing. But in a certain way, scoping out this place to see whether he could get logs, that is a way of anticipating necessity. He's very resourceful. And if it's to build houses or if it's to use for gain or something like that, this is a very resourceful man.
there are complexities to the character and maybe limitations, but rugged individual, that's this fellow. I mean, he's out there absolutely alone in an inhospitable place, without fear, self-reliant, confident that he can master what has to be done, and tries to do it on his own. And I'm not sure that the fact that he fails means that we should simply think the less of him for these particular sort of admirable qualities, qualities which it seems to me are also encouraged by American principles, the American way of life.
So you would, I mean, a lot of people would read this and say, gosh, this guy really is, he should have listened to the old timer in Sulphur Springs. What's wrong with him? Why isn't he more attuned to his own limitations?
There's sometimes a fine line between courage and rashness, between enterprise and foolhardiness. And his dying word is the old timer, you were right, so that there is a certain gesture there. But it would not be an appealing story if he were simply a fool. I mean, there is a certain shortcoming, and it might be the shortcoming of self-reliance altogether. But one has to see this and admire the pluck of the man, the grit of the man, what he actually can do. It's easy to say, fool, youthful fool. Mm-hmm. But there's something attractive about this man who is not going to submit to the wilderness and is going to make something out of it on his own.
America seems to have been built by people like this, pioneers, many of whom launched out into the wilderness from the moment they landed on the coast of this inhospitable continent to the last push across the Great Plains and the deserts. A lot of folks, a lot of Americans reflected this particular willingness to take risks, as you say.
Absolutely.
You know.
Yeah, I appreciate why people will say he's dumb, foolhardy, reckless. But you have to first realize that he has the sort of courage and resolution that few of us have today. Nobody would do this. Now, is that a sign of our prudence? I don't know. But he's absolutely unfazed by the cold. I moved away from Chicago because I can't stand the winters there anymore. Now, you could also say the dog is much smarter. The dog understands what's going on, but the dog has a kind of instinct that this man doesn't.
Yeah, look, I mean, the dog is decisively governed by the instinct of self-preservation. He's a noble animal in many respects and so on, but he makes his way in nature by instinct. He will not make anything of the opportunities that nature provides to live above and beyond self-preservation. And this you have the wonderful example of a person who puts his life at risk to do something beyond mere subsistence. And one could say that's the difference between the humans and the dogs.
The dog, as the last sentence of the story tells us, the one thing the dog needs is fire.
Right.
And he can't build fire.
He can't build fire.
He's off in the direction of the camp that he knew where were the other food providers and fire providers.
Right.
This is a man who has a kind of technological expertise.
Right.
First and foremost, he knows how to build a fire, and by the end of reading this story, we all know how to build fires. And we all know how cold it could get and how a fire really stands between you and death. Okay, but the other thing about him that really emphasizes this brute individualism or the separatism of this kind of American individual. London has this sunless day, and we're reminded of that many times, which means, among other things, that the man doesn't have a shadow.
Right.
Which means, among other things, that he is somehow disconnected even from his inner, what might be his inner life.
At first reading, it does in fact seem to be a sort of a story of the remorseless, grinding force of nature inevitably getting to this guy. And yet, as you say, he seems to be quite attentive, first of all, quite attentive to his surroundings. He knows about these springs. He recognizes he knows how to read the snow on top of the springs so that he can avoid those traps. For a newcomer, he's really quite knowledgeable about his surroundings.
You know, in a certain way, he's got both, if we could repair for a moment to the ancient Greeks, both of the gifts that Prometheus gives to human beings. Fire, which is beginning of all the arts and sciences and technology altogether. And he also has a kind of blind hope. That is, he's blind to, Prometheus gave human beings blind hopes to keep them from fearing death all the time, so that they don't see death before their eyes all their time. They could get on, have hope, be somewhat optimistic. This is a man who shows us that. And I admire that, by the way.
Go, please.
You admire it, and you suggested earlier maybe we can't get along without that sort of character in America. Just a quick question. I mean, are we running out of character?
Much of the story of the building of America is tied to the idea of the frontier. I mean, it's a massive country. And these people, not all of them, by the way, simply solitary individuals, some of them forcing the women and children to go with them to tame the wilderness and to set up little outposts of civilization. Taming the wilderness, pushing back the frontier, encouraged, rewarded, and in a way produced a certain kind of human type. Some people would argue the frontier is gone. I mean, the space age was to be, in a way, according to John Kennedy, the new frontier. We've just closed up shop on that. It's not clear where in modern life those qualities are so obviously called for. We encourage people, in fact, to go backpacking and hiking to probably develop some of these skills and to discover these encounters, though there, by the way, it's usually with the idea that nature is your friend.
No, not quite. In fact, it's worse than that. We have special camps for people to go to learn how to be rugged individuals. How to build a fire.
Yeah.
I mean, you go to a summer camp in order to learn this. It's no longer really an evident part of the American grain.
The whole American understanding, political understanding, doesn't begin with the view that nature is your friend and the state of nature is the best place for human beings. The state of nature is the place where life is solitary, nasty, poor, brutish, and short. And civilization, and beginning with security and followed by liberty and the ability to pursue your own happiness, to secure those things depends really on separating yourself from nature and partly taming the nature within, but also recognizing that big nature out there isn't simply your friend. Jack London manages to bring home to us city dwellers a certain kind of reminder that the big truth out there is cold, vast, indifferent, and largely deadly, unless you're able to master your resources and tame it, do something with it.
And he's American because his own interests seem to come first.
Yeah.
And as the Federalist reminds us, the entire Constitution is founded on the importance of self-interest. To supply by opposite and rival interests the defect of better motives.
Just so that we don't misunderstand the character of his individualism, however, he isn't a radically isolated misanthrope. He is, in fact, on his way, right?
To meet the boys.
To meet the boys. So there is, at the end of the trail,
yeah,
so to
that's
speak,
very important.
there is he has in mind a small domestic setting with a fire and a hot meal at 6 p.m. That is what sort of drives him.
Yeah, domestic, I wouldn't say. There are no women and children.
They're not particularly concerned about washing up the dishes after.
Oh, they might wash the dishes, but unlike the rather romanticized Little House on the Prairie, right? I mean, these guys are there to begin with for gold. And they're not family men. I mean, now
that's true.
And by the way, the conceit of human nature that's behind the Declaration of Independence doesn't begin with us in families. It begins with us as solitary individuals. It's individuals who have rights, not groups, not even families. So that there is a certain encouragement of this, though the perpetuation of any institutions, never mind perpetuation of life itself, depends upon the bachelors giving up the gold and building the log cabins, and in fact recognizing that they're mortal and that they have to provide for those who come after them.
Two quick small points. One is, it's probably not an accident that he calls the men that he's going to, the boys.
The boys,
and,
right.
That's very nice.
But I haven't finished.
So please finish.
But that part is,
And companions.
yeah.
Companions.
And companions are people that you literally eat bread with. So that it is an establishment of some kind.
No, absolutely fair. Absolutely fair. On the other hand, and maybe this is worth a few minutes, Jack London doesn't give us his name.
Well,
And he dies in an unmarked place.
before you go to the question of his name or lack thereof, which I think really is very important, why isn't he named? You gave a litany of the reasons that he is so characteristically American. But one thing that you, I think, didn't mention or didn't emphasize, this is a man without any tradition. And that is evident in his, the way in which he stands with respect to the advice of the old-timer, the man from Sulphur Creek, who lays down the law when it's 50 degrees below zero, you build a fire or you take a companion with you. So he takes the Declaration of Independence, the radical individuality, to its ultimate.
Yeah.
On the one hand, we can't do without that. We wouldn't have been America, right? Without the bachelors who were willing to throw themselves into the wilderness from the very beginning of the nation. And yet you're suggesting that that's not enough.
The Constitution doesn't simply rely on the solitary individuals when it sets about constituting a republic that is going to safeguard the rights of individuals. Insofar as we are by design a large commercial republic, that requires, it encourages self-interest, but requires additional things. I mean, it requires certain kinds of cooperation. There are certain kinds of virtues that go along with this in order, in fact, for trade to be possible. I mean, self-interest rightly understood carries with it certain kinds of things that moderate the isolation and the mere selfishness that might otherwise be encouraged here.
Why do you think he's not named?
Yeah, it's an odd circumstance, because even his friend Bud, who advised him on the one piece of equipment that he regrets not having brought with him, namely a nose guard that would have protected his cheek, even Bud is named. And of course, Buddy goes back to our sort of fraternal.
Oh, that's very nice.
Fraternal gathering here. Yeah, this is no man or he's every man, right? I mean, this is a type of human being, and to give it a name, to give him a name, it would be to pin it down, I think.
Bill suggested two things, and I think the fact that he is constantly no name man, the man, suggests both that he's nobody, literally nobody, and his death palpably shows us that. He is not buried by anybody. He freezes to death by himself. But on the other hand, he is every American. He's got all of the quintessential virtues and vices that are American.
Let me embrace both of those and add a third thing which cuts slightly different direction. This man is not governed by the desire to make a name for himself. In other words, he's not moved by honor. He's moved by gain.
A commercial man doesn't leave his name on things until he becomes philanthropic man.
And that's partly because at that time in his life, he doesn't need as much imagination to recognize that the end is coming.
Right, right.
whereas the young man is described in this really sort of beautiful passage. But all this, the mysterious, far-reaching hairline trail, the absence of sun from the sky, the tremendous cold, the strangeness and weirdness of it all, made no impression on the man. It was not because he was long used to it. He was a newcomer in the land, a Chichakwa, and this was his first winter. The trouble with him was that he was without imagination. He was quick and alert in the things of life, but only in the things and not in the significances. 50 degrees below zero meant 80-odd degrees of frost. Such fact impressed him as being cold and uncomfortable, and that was all. It did not lead him to meditate upon his frailty as a creature of temperature, and upon man's frailty in general, able only to live within certain narrow limits of heat and cold. And from there, it did not lead him to the conjectural field of immortality and man's place in the universe. 50 degrees below zero stood for a bite of frost that hurt and that must be guarded against by the use of mittens, ear flaps, warm moccasins, and thick socks. 50 degrees below zero was to him just precisely 50 degrees below zero. That there should be anything more to it than that was a thought that never entered his head. There are lots of things that a man without imagination doesn't imagine, but he certainly, and young people perhaps even more than others, don't, thanks to the fact that they have more blind hope than the rest of us, don't see the day of doom before them, not today and not tomorrow, but not at all. And add to that, I mean, this is, I think, a wonderful touch. He's got temperature. He's taken cold and measured it according to the tools of science and instrumentation. But the human meaning of being cold in the world, it's not there. He's got a watch. And when the fire is put out, the thing that bothers him is he's going to be an hour late getting to camp. I mean, to live by the clock and to take confidence in the way in which we've measured time or measured the world is in part to give us great power in nature, but it's in a way to blind us to the things that the quantification of the world has made invisible to us. That's modern man, that's technological man, it's American life. The story, I think, shows us something of the insufficiency of that, the tragedy of it, as well as its power.
And yet, when he is carried away by imagination, later in the story,
Right.
when the dawning realization of his impending doom begins to loom in his imagination, right? It isn't productive. It doesn't lead him initially. It doesn't lead him
Exactly.
to a philosophical place. It leads him to panic, right? And his imagination finally escapes from his control. Then he panics. Then he runs, starts to run blindly. And that's the first time that you see him out of control.
But it doesn't
He was-
last long. It doesn't last long.
Right.
And I think we're told he panics twice. Mm-hmm. And even though he's panicked, after the first thing, he's shocked when he realizes that the avalanche has occurred and he has to do this over again. And his arms are on fire. But despite the fact that he's panicked, he works carefully and methodically.
Right.
But then he panics again, and as you say, he runs like a crazy man. But not for very long, because he realizes his feet are not going to carry him that far. He can't do it.
Is having a lively imagination overrated? And aren't we better off being sort of nose to the ground, practical-minded people who attend to the here and now and go about our business and let destiny take care of itself?
Well, you know, the story occurs on a day without clouds, right? And as night draws on, there's nothing but these sparkling stars that seem to be, you know, so close to Earth. There's nothing, right, between this spot on Earth and the cosmos, this freezing cold cosmos. You need something. You need to draw something over that. The dog understands that in cold weather, you either get under, you know, snuggle down into the snow, or you wait until a cloud cover.
I also thought you might be suggesting that, I mean, again, to go back to certain things in the founding and tie it to this man, when Madison writes in Federalist 10 in defense of the extended commercial republic, and he thinks about the causes of that great evil of popular government majority faction, there are three causes. There are opinions, which very often mean, I mean, religious opinions or things that fill the imaginations and longings of the soul. There are passions of loves and hates, very often connected with glory-seeking, ambitious people who are also filled with imagination. And then there's the rather prosaic matter of, you know, self-interest, this worldly, rather narrow things. And the suggestion is a politics built on the first two is very dangerous, dangerous even for ordinary survival and security, so that it's a country, in a way, by design, meant to sort of lower the sights of the imagination and perhaps provide something of this cloud cover in enterprise, business, commerce, the things of daily life. Though one would want to say, from a different strand than the Federalist, churches, at least on Sundays, right? I mean, there's a certain other, certain aspect to this, which, I mean, it may not be true that it's just empty space and indifference up there.
Right, right.
But he seems to suggest, both through his language and the numerous repetitions in this, that necessity is much greater than you are. Nature is much bigger than you are. And finally, when this man tips his hat to the old man whom he's resisting all this time and acknowledges he was right, he seems to be suggesting we have to submit.
Well, submit, or we have to acknowledge our dependence on one another. The old man didn't say don't go out if it's less than 50 degrees. It says don't go out alone.
Exactly.
And it's a certain reminder of our vulnerability, but not that we should simply lie down before nature. And
If I'm right in suggesting that the whole stylistic structure of the story forces you to think that this man finally doesn't have a will, that he is incapable of shaping the world.
the world.
He's just incapable of it. Now, do you want to say that if he had a companion, that would not, you would not see that?
Okay, very nice. I guess I would like to put together both of our points this way. The story teaches the reader, even if it teaches the man only in death, that there are limits to what enterprise and individual assertion against nature can do. That you can have your watch and your thermometer and you can build a fire, but it happens. It happens. But also it is a correction not only against the sort of technological mentality and the mastery of nature, that aspect, but it's also a correction to believe that I am self-reliant in all my enterprises, and that with other human beings acknowledging one's limitations, one's personal limitations, and the need for others, one does not die alone. and different kind of life is possible.
And interestingly enough, of course, at the end, although he is dying alone quite literally, what is the last sort of imagining, when he's finally imagining, when his mind is floating away from the body, you know, which it sort of admitted in before, and he's now sort of, what he's imagining, right, is the boy, are the boys coming down the trail, him somehow among them,
yeah.
finding himself on the trail. So he, in the final analysis, even though he's dying alone, he understands that you do require that component of civilization. You do require, you want the boys somehow to be there, to find you, to be returned, to be buried in a decent fashion.
My sense is the snow is going to cover him up, and maybe in the springtime, they will discover his bones.
Instead of logs.
Right.
Instead
of logs to carry out, they'll carry him out. Do you think this is a tragedy in the classical sense, that the outcome is somehow that there's a certain kind of flaw in the man which is connected to his greatness or to what's admirable about him? Or do you think it just happened? In other words, is this just a sad story with no happy ending? You began with that. It's not a happy ending. Lots of people read this and expect, they're hoping that, you know, he's going to make it back to camp or the next fire. But are we meant to see this as finally somehow an indictment of this man, or at least seeing this as what happened to him was the cosmic answer to his limitations? Or do we want to say, tough luck? He didn't make it, lots of other people would.
What do I think? It's both.
It's
It's
nice.
both. And I want to say it's both because, as you know probably far better than I, tragedy is, the core of tragedy is not only paradox, but the paradox is this. Necessity sets the course, but human beings still remain responsible. And you see that so vividly in this particular story.
Actually, now that you put it that way, it occurs to me to say, look, the peculiar kind of comeuppance for self-confident, enterprising people is that they don't really allow for chance. It happens. Twice it happens. And it's treated by the man, London writing for the man treats this as if it's happenstance rather than a kind of possibility that ought not to have been forgotten.
It happened, but it didn't have to happen.
Yeah.
Yet it had to happen.
So, but what does that say about the American character? To return us to this, you know, now that we've sort of gone to the heights of Greek tragedy, what are we meant to learn from this as Americans? Is Jack London telling us something about our limitations?
This is too good a story, I think, to be reducible to a kind of take-home moral lesson. I mean, lots of people, I think, could do it that way. Here's a typical American enterprising fool. But he holds up a kind of mirror in which Americans can see themselves, and invites us to consider, I mean, really, are we going to walk away from this story and say, well, don't build a fire under a tree, wear the nose guard, and for goodness sakes, go with Buddy. And bad things won't happen to you. Or are you going to say, you know, enterprise is fine, living by watch and thermometer and fire is fine. Remember that there are some other things going on here that you should pay some attention to, and if you don't, you might miss out. I do think that it's an invitation to us to ponder the limits of some things which are wonderfully admirable. And it seems to me you don't have to surrender. You don't have to surrender individuality. You don't have to surrender enterprise. You don't have to surrender trying to tame nature to make it a home for human beings in order to understand that you're not immortal, that you need help, and that not by fire can everything be done.
That's very nice, but I don't think it is really what Jack London's unique contribution is.
Please.
And I think it has to do with the fact that Jack London doesn't repair to something providential, as we said. There's nothing greater than us. But there is one thing. It points to the need of stories.
Some more.
We can appreciate this individual. We can appreciate some of the characteristics. But the story itself is what educates the reader. And the reader is meant to see not only his strengths, but look, that is an American tragedy. You follow that path, that is tragic. How do you, in a certain sense, transform that or re-educate the heart? You re-educate the heart through the kinds of stories that you write about such people.
To really be a deeply attached American, one has to understand the American soul in all of its complexity, its strengths, its liabilities, its weaknesses, its glories. And the stories that we've chosen to illustrate the American character are none of them morality plays. I mean, they all are mirrors in which we are invited to think really much more deeply about what it means to be the kind of human being that grows up in a regime dedicated to liberty, equality, enterprise, religious freedom, religious toleration, and the power of the individual human being.
Well, thank you very much for being here today and helping us with this short story, To Build a Fire.